Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. So on this episode, we're traveling to the Caucasus, a place where geopolitics moves faster than prime Usain Bolt, and drama is served hotter than Georgian khachapuri. Specifically, we're talking about Abkhazia, a region of Georgia under Russian occupation that's caught between a rock and a hard place, and a Russian bear that just won't let it go. The region is technically part of Georgia, but you wouldn't know it if you asked Georgia, or Russia, or anyone really. This political ambiguity has made Abkhazia a geopolitical pressure cooker, where local aspirations, Russian meddling, and Georgian hopes of reunification clash like three drunk uncles at a wedding. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Aslan Bzhanya, the leader of Abkhazia, a breakaway region of Georgia, has resigned following days of violent protests. Demonstrators had stormed key government buildings to oppose new laws allowing Russians to purchase property in the scenic Black Sea region, widely viewed as a step towards deepening Russian influence. Vice President Badra Gunba was appointed acting president.
I have begun to exercise the powers and duties of the President of the Republic of Abkhazia. I instruct all heads of state administration bodies to perform their functions in accordance with the legislation of the Republic of Abkhazia, to preserve and ensure the viability of the state.
The unrest began Friday when protesters demanded the resignation of Abkhazia's self-declared president Aslan Bzhanya. The clashes left at least 14 people injured, according to Russian state media. Protesters accused Bzhanya, a Moscow ally, of compromising Abkhazian sovereignty. The unrest reflects long-standing concerns over Abkhazia's reliance on Moscow. Kremlin was quick to comment on the situation.
Bilateral relations between Russia and Abkhazia are a very important priority of our foreign policy, and of course, we are committed to the speedy normalization of the situation.
While Russia recognizes the region of more than 240,000 people as independent, many Abkhazians fear becoming a client state. The region, known for its mountains and beaches, is a popular destination for Russian tourists, driving demand for property there. Abkhazia broke away from Georgia in 1993 and further cemented its separation during the 2008 Russia-Georgia War. However, tensions persist over its status and the region's close ties to Moscow.
And now, as tradition dictates, we're going to explore the issue in greater detail. Let's begin with the headlines, because trust me when I say this, Abkhazia doesn't see the spotlight very often. The de facto leader of the breakaway authorities has resigned. Why? Well, you could say he's pulling a Putin and leaving his post to... Oh wait, nope, it's not voluntary, you see. Protests in the region escalated faster than a family argument over Thanksgiving dinner, demanding his ouster after accusations of corruption and a CVS-level long list of grievances. For context, Abkhazia declared independence from Georgia in the 1990s, but it's only recognized by Russia and a small club of countries that owe Moscow more than a few favors. Protests erupted last week, and they lasted for several days. Eventually, thousands of people stormed Abkhazia's parliament, and not because they were trying to pass a law. Protesters were angry about alleged corruption, a worsening economy, and, this is rich, too much dependence on Russia. Even Abkhazia is saying, "You're clingy, Moscow, give me some space." This region has been stuck in a geopolitical limbo for decades, relying heavily on Russian military and economic support, while feeling increasingly like a pawn in Moscow's chess game. Russia, for its part, isn't happy either. The Kremlin called for stability, which, if you're familiar with Russian diplomacy, translates roughly to "don't screw up our influence." But that's easier said than done when your entire foreign policy is built on meddling, coercion, and, the occasional invasion. On the other side, you've got Georgia. Tbilisi's official stance is that Abkhazia is part of Georgia. But let's be real, Georgia's got more pressing issues to worry about right now. And then there is Russia, the uninvited guest at this party who'd brought moonshine, vodka, and a side of imperialism. Moscow has been the main power broker in Abkhazia ever since the 1990s. The war, which took place there, was actually the moment when Russian influence has begun. And later on, Russia has stationed troops and funded much of the local government. But as Abkhazia's protests show, even Moscow's friends aren't thrilled with the Kremlin's grip. Russia wants to keep Abkhazia under its thumb without drawing too much attention. It is already dealing with a full plate of problems, including its disastrous war in Ukraine and sanctions that have the Russian economy running slower than Windows 95. If the situation in Abkhazia spirals out of control, it could create a domino effect across other breakaway regions like South Ossetia or even Transnistria. So where does this leave Abkhazia then? Well, right now, it's anyone's guess, really. What is clear is that the region is at a turning point, with big implications for Georgia, Russia, and yes, for the West too. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Dorka Tokac, researcher from the Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So the situation in Abkhazia is interesting, but it isn't actually the first time that a local leader has been toppled. It appears that Laslan Bjanya is actually the third one to suffer this fate. What does it tell us about the way that this region is governed?
I think it tells a lot about the uncertainty and about the instability of this region. So eventually, we know that Abkhazia is backed and recognized by Russia, but there are very few countries alone which recognize it, which means that also political stability is somewhat absent, including and considering rule of law as well. And obviously that leads to certain other problems as well, because we know that in places where there is a lack of rule of law, there is a lack of legal systems, legal stability, the attraction of FDI is basically always an issue. And there is basically meaning constant financial issues, constant financial problems for the whole country. So eventually, I can clearly see that the goal of this bill, which caused this unrest, which led to the resignation, I can clearly see that the intent was to attract Russian money, Russian investments, because there is a constant need for that.
But it's also interesting because Russia tends to be fairly heavy-handed in case of some countries and some regions. I mean, come to think of it, 2014, Ukraine. Following the collapse of the Yanukovych government, Russia saw it fit to intervene. In this case, however, it appears that Russia is pretty much comfortable with the idea of letting these conflicts and these crises play out and then stepping in and say, okay, let's negotiate. And of course, addressing this proposal to whoever wins the local skirmish, a political one, obviously. Why do you think Russia is not really interested in intervening directly and instead prefers to take a back seat, at least for the time being?
On the one hand, at this point in time, Russia needs all its military capabilities, which it can mobilize at the front with Ukraine. I think that at this moment, they are absolutely unable and therefore also unwilling to deploy any of the troops, which are basically very much needed at the Ukrainian front line now. And also this strategic instability in the region definitely plays into Moscow's hands, because eventually the only forces, the only elites which might be willing and able to invest in the region then are going to be Russians, closely connected and tied to the Kremlin.
And that's a bit of an awkward position for Abkhazia itself, right? Because it doesn't really have anywhere else to go. Would you say that essentially this isn't really about pushing the Russians out or, showing their discontent with the Russian presence? It's more about the details, really, because as you've indicated, they need investments from somewhere. And obviously, these investments are not going to come from Georgia, because Georgia does not consider this to be a separate country. Hardly anyone does, anyway. But Russia is still willing to put the money one way or another. So does this mean that whatever happens, whatever political crisis is going to happen now or in the future, it's not likely to change the geopolitical situation there, at least not much?
Yes, this is what I see. So this is what I foresee. Eventually, the situation, and especially the geopolitical situation there, is not likely to change, which means that the only interested individuals and entities wanting and wishing to invest there are going to be Russians, who basically are now pretty much restricted from other places in the world. So, for instance, we clearly see that Abkhazia mostly because of its beautiful nature and its very pleasant climate, has become one of the top destinations for tourists from Russia, who can also visit this region with their domestic ID. They cannot really do that with other countries abroad. Therefore, we clearly see that Russians would want to go to this place. Most likely, the Kremlin wants to appease also this request from the elites. Eventually, this is a lovely seaside resort. There are lovely seaside resorts there, and the Russian elite wants to go to chill somewhere, to spend their holidays somewhere. Therefore, places like Abkhazia are clearly going to be gaining further reputation amongst Russians.
And a similar thing could be said about Crimea, which, brings you to, I guess, you can, reach a conclusion that it's kind of darkly ironic that Russia is really fighting to get its so-called, seaside Riviera back. One place, another place, they really want to, get these holiday spots back, not recognizing the fact that they are in different countries right now. So when looking at Abkhazia, in a very general sense, would you say that the situation there is also similar? Because there is genuine separatism, as opposed to, say, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, which really did not have any sort of real separatists. Instead, well, these were essentially Russian agents, fomenting unrest. Here, it's kind of different, isn't it?
It's somewhat different. However, like in most cases, this is also certain parts of the local corrupted elites. For certain local corrupted elites, situations like this are simply better because simply they can fish better in a smaller pond than let alone a bigger country. Therefore, to maintain this instability and to maintain their local power definitely serves the interests of the elites as well, who can obviously have a well-established and palpable influence in certain parts of the popular opinion as well.
And economically, does Abkhazia even stand a chance to survive if it wasn't for Russian tourism, really? Because it's kind of isolated. As we've already established, it's not recognized by the international community. So would you say that this is essentially a lifeline, and the local population is running a bit of a risk, perhaps not trying to cut this lifeline off, but meddling with it a bit?
Yes, I agree. So eventually there are the opportunities for financing Abkhazia and also financing the needs of the local population are rather limited, but I clearly see that tourism is going to stay there. So eventually this bill aimed to facilitate Russian individuals to get real estate, which is prohibited by law since decades. And eventually this would be the main shift. And obviously Abkhazian people are afraid that they will simply be swallowed by this apparently increasing and rapidly increasing Russian presence. But I do not really see the reason why tourism would suffer any harsh consequences from all this. Therefore, I clearly see that the economic situation and the economic influx coming from tourism and with tourism is going to stay.
Would you say that this is also a part of a broader mechanism? I mean, we're seeing this in Ukraine, and obviously, there are, missiles flying around. The situation is rather different in Crimea, for example. But again, Russia is trying to rebuild places like Mariupol, which it itself destroyed, not asking anyone for permission, and, essentially trying to cover up their war crimes with an influx of money. So would you say that this mechanism does actually pose a danger to the international community that, within a couple of decades, for example, everyone is going to forget about it because they're going to say, oh, look, there is economic prosperity, there are no signs of conflict, and that Russia is going to slowly digest regions like that simply through this mechanism. And it's just a question of when, and the pace at which it does so.
Yes, I see this as a very worrisome future this way, because clearly this part of the world is definitely not at the front line, and this is not at the forefront of international geopolitics, especially not at this moment, but it has not even really been in the past decades, and I don't really see the reason why it would change, which means that yes, Russia is obviously going to exert its influence in the region, covering up its crimes with economic prosperity wherever it's possible, and the world is going to absolutely forget about it all.
Surely, it does not really help, that the current Georgian government, following elections which are believed to have been interfered with, to say the least, Well, it's not going to protest as much as a truly democratic government would. I mean, they have aligned themselves with Russia despite their promises of keeping, the pro-European course. It's not really happening right now. So would you say that the situation is unfortunately there to stay because of this, confluence of geopolitical factors, i.e. The government in Georgia right now, of a Georgian Dream Party, preferring to keep close ties with Moscow, and Abkhazia itself really not having any other viable options?
Absolutely. So, given that, there is no one else to really protest against this, if it is not the Georgian government, but the Georgian Dream coming to power. Even though they cannot go entirely against the Georgian popular opinion, so they cannot be overly friendly with Russia, at least not on the level of rhetorics. We know their ties with Moscow. We know their intentions to cultivate close and good connections with Moscow, which means that obviously limits their willingness and ability to protest against anything like that. And if they do not that, no one else will.
And finally, would you see any sort of options for future changes? For example, looking more at Georgia than Abkhazia itself, would you say that the opposition and the international public opinion still have any sort of leverage? Because it does seem like, of course, there are doubts and there are protests regarding the results of the elections, but nothing else is really happening which could change the situation on the ground.
We certainly have some leverage. I mean the West and the collective West altogether. But I think that this leverage, especially if we do not use this leverage, this is clearly fading because we see very clearly that Russia has intentions to keep this region and, for instance, the Georgian popular opinion, Georgia and the neighbor and the region as well, under its control, manipulating the public opinion, interfering in politics, interfering in business lives, and so on. So we clearly see that Russia is demonstratively there, sometimes via oligarchs, sometimes via proxies, but we see that Russia is there and Russia is there to stay. And we see it less and less from the EU, which oftentimes sends contradictory messages, which are very difficult for the popular opinion to understand, decode, and to get encouragement from. That, for instance, the European integration is the path to go, and so on. So, in order to counterbalance this Russian influence seeking in the region, we would desperately need pronounced Western influence as well, and which is apparently fading away.
So it is regrettable to see what used to be a vibrant democracy slowly being smothered and fading away. And part of the blame lies with European and Western leaders in general for a lack of strategy regarding Georgia. Dorka Tokac was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Okay, we got it. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The US Embassy in Ukraine has issued a warning about a potential significant air attack on the 20th of November, citing specific information about the threat. In response, the embassy announced it would temporarily close and urged US citizens to be prepared to seek shelter immediately if air raid sirens sound.
As Russia launches daily attacks on Ukraine, the US Embassy in Kyiv said the capital could be a target for a particularly big one. The embassy did not provide additional details about the potential attack, but the alert coincides with ongoing air raid warnings in parts of Ukraine, including Kyiv. The warning follows an update to Russia's nuclear doctrine by President Vladimir Putin on November 19th, marking the 1000th day of the war in Ukraine. The revised policy includes provisions for nuclear strikes in response to aggression against Russia or its allies by non-nuclear states supported by nuclear-armed nations, as well as large-scale aerial attacks with conventional weapons such as drones. While the Pentagon has stated there are no indications that Russia is preparing to deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Russian forces continue to launch large-scale attacks on Ukrainian regions using drones, missiles, and other weapons.
Exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has criticized anti-riot drills conducted by Belarusian police as a prelude to suppressing dissent ahead of the upcoming elections. scheduled for the 26th of January. The elections are expected to result in the long-time ruler Alexander Lukashenko securing a seventh term.
Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya claims that the ongoing training of security forces in Belarus marks preparation for a crackdown on dissent before the fictitious election. Speaking from Estonia, where she sought support for Belarus's opposition, she said the drills are a sign that the government fears public reaction to the outcome of the elections. Belarusian authorities claim the drills aim to combat extremism and ensure public order, but video footage from the Interior Ministry showed riot police practicing shield formations and baton strikes to break up protests. Lukashenko's previous election in 2020, widely denounced as fraudulent by the US and EU, sparked mass protests that were met with violent crackdowns, arrests and alleged torture. Many opposition figures, including Tsikhanouskaya's husband, remain imprisoned or in exile.
Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev agreed to strengthen economic cooperation during Tokayev's landmark visit to Belgrade. This marks the first visit by a Kazakh president to Serbia.
The visit of Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev to Belgrade saw the signing of 10 agreements and memorandums, including those on defense cooperation, readmission and the peaceful use of outer space. In a joint press conference, Tokayev highlighted the commitment of both nations to deepen bilateral relations with a focus on industries such as mining, healthcare and manufacturing. Vučić expressed gratitude for Kazakhstan's continued political support regarding Kosovo, whose independence Serbia contests. While Serbia's trade ties with the Eurasian Economic Union have drawn criticism from the European Union, which Serbia aspires to join, Vučić emphasized the importance of expanding international partnerships.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.